Great. Welcome, everybody, to our closing plenary of the conference, which the title of this session is going to be Rebuilding Public Confidence in Recycling. My name, again, is Alec Cooley. I am both an NRC board member and a co-chair of this conference, and I work for Bush Systems as a senior advisor on the day. But welcome to this program. In a few minutes, I'm going to be joined by a panel of experts from across the U.S. To talk about this topic of how do we engage the public in the face of the confusion and some of the skepticism that has developed in recent years around the recycling system. How do we keep people engaged? So we'll come back to that in a moment. But before we do so, I do want to give a shout out to one of our sponsors. We're going to play a video here from Balcones, who is one of our sponsors. And give me one moment.
Hello, National Recycling Congress attendees. My name is Natalie Betts. I'm with Balcones Resources, and we are very proud to be a silver sponsor of this event. Balcones Resources is based in Austin, Texas, and we operate 5 different recycling facilities across the United States. We are one of the largest independent recyclers, actually, in our country. We are growing to be 8 facilities by 2024. We'll be adding locations in San Antonio and Phoenix, and we are continuing to grow throughout the country. We are looking for communities who are committed to their recycling program to work with us. We are only a recycler. We don't own a landfill, and we don't do any municipal hauling. So our goals are the same as yours. We want to maximize the quantity and quality of recyclables, and we want to make recycling work for the long term. So if that's something you're interested in working with us on or want to know more, please reach out to us. You can find us at balconesresources.com, or you can talk to me at partnerships@balconesresources.com. Have a great rest of your Congress.
Great. So thank you to Balcones as a sponsor. Again, we can't do this conference without the support of Balcones and our other sponsors. So we very much appreciate their contribution to making this event successful. So to set the stage for today's conversation, we're going to close this conference on this topic of recycling behavior. The modern recycling system is large and complex, as we all know. It encompasses a broad range of materials and the operations to collect, process, and transform them into new items. Over the last day and a half, we've discussed many aspects of what it takes to make this system happen and to improve it over time. Issues ranging from policy to market development to investing in infrastructure, product design. But at the end of the day, all of these moving parts of the recycling system and the multitudes of stakeholders that are involved are all dependent on a single common denominator. We all depend on the decision that tens of millions of people make throughout their day to place waste items into the correct bin. Without this individual action, none of the work that we do is possible. Since the dawn of the modern era of recycling, we've done public messaging to engage people in the system. Most of the effort is focused on giving people the information they need on how to participate, as well as encouraging them to make recycling a part of their daily routine. As those of us here know all too well, the last few years have been quite a challenge for recycling. The crisis around contamination and the ripple effects that has had with China's national soil policy, volatile commodity markets, disruptions to local collection programs. These are all impacts to the recycling system that we know very familiar as professionals. For better or worse, these challenges have received a tremendous amount of media attention. The general narrative of these stories has been to reinforce a perception that recycling is dysfunctional, or at worst, it's even broken. There's increasing evidence that this turmoil and this attention, in turn, is having a negative impact on how the public perceive recycling. These perceptions and the general confusion that people have presents a risk, I would argue, and others would, presents a risk to some people simply disengaging and either falling off on the frequency that they recycle or altogether. After all, whether you're a passionate environmentalist or someone who simply recycles out of habit, no one wants to feel that the effort they make to sort items is a waste of time. How we as an industry address this issue is the question we're going to focus on with today's panel. The problems and dysfunctionalities of the recycling system are, of course, real. They go beyond simple perceptions. So, some of the questions we need to address are, how do we be transparent about these problems, knowing that there's a lot of work that needs to be done to improve the system, and yet still be able to reassure people here and now that they need to stay invested with recycling, that it's still worth their effort. What are some of the key messages that can give people help to rebuild that sense of confidence on a realistic level with the system? And how do we juggle these types of messages along with Recycle Right and other public messaging that needs to be done around recycling? So to help me explore these issues, I'm joined by a panel of respected folks from across the country to make some introductions. We'll be joined in a moment by Chaz Miller with Miller Recycling Associates, with over 45 years of experience in the recycling field, ranging from the US EPA to the Glass Packaging Institute, and more recently, the National Waste and Recycling Association. Chaz brings a deep knowledge of the industry to this discussion. Wes Schultz, professor of psychological science at Cal State San Marcos. Through his 30 years of research into the behavioral aspects of recycling and other environmental issues, Wes will help us understand how the average person thinks about recycling and how they respond to messaging. Then I'm joined by Elizabeth Schuessler, who is a senior director of social change, behavior, and impact with the Recycling Partnership. Through her role with the partnership's recently launched Center for Sustainable Behavior and Impact, and through her years of experience in the recycling field, Elizabeth has an expert perspective on public communications and engagement strategies to bring to this conversation. And finally, we're joined by Dan Weston, who has been with the Washington State Department of Ecology for about 10 years and is the department's current statewide recycling coordinator. In his capacity, coordinating the development of policy and outreach strategies around recycling, waste reduction, and reuse, Dan brings a practical boots on the ground perspective to this conversation about public messaging. So with that, first, what I want to do is invite Elizabeth Schuessler to step up and help us to understand sort of this issue. I know the Recycling Partnership has done quite a bit of a survey work and some others, and if you could just sort of give us a quick primer on what you're seeing.
Thank you, Alec. Oh, thanks, Alec. It is great to be here today to talk about this very important topic and to be joined by everyone on this panel. What a way to wrap up a great meeting and really take some actionable items forward. The Recycling Partnership, if you're not familiar with us, you can go to recyclingpartnership.org and check us out. If you are familiar with us, you can still visit recyclingpartnership.org because things change quickly over here. We're always adding new articles and new results from the work that we're doing. So today I want to talk to you a little bit about what we and others have seen around this topic. So Alec and I were talking a couple of months ago about, what's really happening in this space to combat the negative media stories. And it is challenging to be, with Thanksgiving coming up, it is challenging to be with friends and family out when people who know what you're doing are asking, do things can really get recycled? And so we're going to talk today a little bit about what we're looking at and what precedes the confidence, what boosts the confidence, what negatively impacts it, and how we're going to how the Recycling Partnership is going to take action on some of those things to see what it is that is actually needed to boost that confidence. So one of the first topics that Alec and I were talking about were these results from the Shelton group showing that when they asked, how confident are you that the things you toss in the recycling bin actually get recycled? And here we're just looking at who answered the not at all or not very confident. In 2019, there was just 14%. And I will say and Wes, maybe you could agree or disagree, but I would say from our point of view, 14% disagreeing. There are just some people who are dispositionally disagreeable or not trusting. They just dispositionally aren't trusting. So that doesn't really surprise me. It doesn't alarm me. In 2020, it creeped up a little, but 2020 was, an unusual year in so many ways. It was kind of like, well, what's really happening? And then when they went back in and looked at it, it had jumped up to 30%. And so that's alarming because if people don't think that their recyclables that they put in their bin are actually getting recycled. That is a real problem, and it's going to be hard to come back from that. So that is why we're here today. Another study from this group in Great Britain, they asked in the last 6 months or so, have you seen or heard something that's impacted your thoughts about recycling, either positively or negatively? 11% had heard something about recycling where their confidence went up, 14% went down, 21% stayed about the same, and the rest of the either heard nothing or didn't know. So in those results, what I see in those results is more people hearing something when going down, is that 14% looks big, even though the number between the 11 and 21, it's kind of in the middle there. It is really concerning. And then, so what we've done is we wanted, with this new Center for Sustainable Behavior and Impact, we launched what we're calling a confidence index, recycling confidence index. And we asked a number of questions. It was general population survey, 3,000 people. What we know is that we historically have heard from a number of agencies, and I'm sure many of you have heard this in your results, is recycling really has a positive kind of brand promise and positive presence. And so 7, 8, 9 out of 10 people have typically that's been the range where people are saying recycling is positive and makes a difference. And that's really this aspirational and abstract concept. And then when we started to asking about my things, similar to Shelton's question, my items are becoming new things. That's really where the rubber meets the road for that concrete understanding of recycling mattering and being worth the effort. And so you see that there in the middle, like aspirationally, it still has a lot of promise. Realistically, I have some doubt. Worth the effort, I'm still kind of in the middle. And so that's, and I'm not saying me myself, that would be terrible. I am saying that I know that there is a lot of recycling going on. And this morning I was touring Balcones. They have a beautiful facility here in Austin, which is not my hometown. So it was great to be here visiting with them. But recycling is happening. Recycling is working in many ways. And then there are many ways that it is not. And so the whole story of recycling is so complicated. How do we communicate that with people in a way that answers their questions, gives them the reassurance that Alec mentioned, reassures them that it is worth their effort? Like, what does it take? Is it a logical explanation, emotional explanation, or do we need to meet them empathetically? So that's some of the testing we're doing. In addition to this confidence index, there's more on our website about the confidence index. This first look at it, this is really an inaugural look at confidence. We're expanding it next year to look more at trust upstream. One of the problems I've had with the concept of behavior change, it is kind of looking down the stream to say, well, the people down there need to do better. And honestly, it is all of us throughout the entire system that need to, be more intentional, be more honest, be more forthcoming, be more pushing for higher standards, pushing for more information, and really creating the system, because we are really, like, we create the system together. So to create the system that is worth the effort, to create the system where there is confidence. So this first index has 10 components here, 5 on the kind of programmatic, like it's more logistical, it's the context of recycling, and 5 on the perception-based factors, which is more of the, how do I feel about it? What do I think about it? What, is it difficult for me? That sort of thing. And so it'll be interesting next year to see how this fares. And we have to see if we can get those numbers up, and what is it about those numbers that's driving confidence up or down, and how do we address that? So that's what we're here to talk about today. And I look forward to a robust conversation here.
Great. Thank you, Elizabeth. So let's just jump in. I guess the first question I would throw out is to unpack what's going on here. What is the broader dynamic? I made reference in my opening remarks to a media narrative and how that can shape perceptions, but that's obviously sort of a one-dimensional understanding of it. If we look at all the different trends that have been happening around contamination, as well as issues like single-use plastics, I'm curious if anybody wants to jump in, and Chaz, I'm actually just going to toss this one to you first, but talk a little bit about what you see happening broadly that's influencing and building these perceptions.
Well, the first answer is obvious. It's Greenpeace with their attack on plastic recycling a week or two ago. It was a stunning attack on plastic recycling, riddled with errors. Yet it's gotten a lot of press play. It's been picked up by PBS, you name it, Boston Globe. And I think Dan Lee, for instance, at Resource Recycling, did an excellent job unpacking the flaws in their methodology. I made my own modest contribution with my Waste 360 column, but the recycling community needs to be much more vigorous in saying, wait, there is a very substantial plastic recycling industry. There is a very substantial recycling industry, and those industries would not exist if people were not putting their recyclables on the curbside. Granted, we're not their only recycled feedstock. We were very definitely part of the party. And I think we need to be much more proactive on that.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Yeah, certainly a lot of stories that have been quick to conflate different issues and not do very good fact checking is certainly part of it. Wes or Dan, or does anybody else want to jump in, and in terms of what you're seeing as broader, what's influencing? If not, I guess I would. You go ahead.
Dan was gonna say something, but it looks like he's muted. So I was just calling his attention to that.
Yeah, sorry, I got a message that the host muted me. Yeah, I was just going to say that not to push back entirely against Chaz, but I think in Washington we're trying to balance the reality of what we know is happening with plastics recycling, which is that a lot of them are not being recycled or weren't being recycled, especially immediately after the National Sword stuff happened, with what we hope is happening and trying to rebuild confidence in the markets. We have policies that have been put in place in Washington very recently that are hoping to create new markets. We have multiple programs with the Recycling Development Center and our Next Cycle programs that are trying to foster that, but balancing that with our messaging, not trying to be maybe a little bit overly optimistic about what's happening with some of the recyclables. And I think that's been our biggest challenge in our outreach over the last couple of years. Is the primary focus has been on contamination reduction to try to clean up the stream and maybe develop the markets that we know are more robust currently, and then balancing that with not trying to discourage people. We're hearing a lot of that anecdotally from residents, from local community members, that people aren't sure that the materials are being recycled. And in some cases that is true. So not trying to completely push back against what Chaz said, but I think it's more of a balancing act for us than just a straight, let's try to restore confidence and focusing purely on that messaging.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, to build on it, I think the problem is these high-profile stories that come out about recycling failures, and people are really attentive to these things. They see recycling as a moral issue, and it's like a transgression, a sin. If something that is thrown into the recycling bin doesn't make it to the trash. I mean, it doesn't make it to the actual processing, but ends up in the trash and the landfill. And these high-profile stories undermine people's confidence that if they do it, that it's actually going to result in a positive outcome. So just thinking about the problem, I think that's the current that we're facing against.
In many ways, our public messaging for the last 40 years has been to say recycling is good, do more of it. We started to temper that with contamination and shifting to more of a recycle right. But nonetheless, we've intentionally or unintentionally put recycling up on a pedestal. And it was very easy to knock back down when these stories are coming out, and the fact that a lot of them are based on a reality. And that's just something we have to deal with. And I think going forward, one of the things I want to explore a little bit more as we go into the discussion is how do we thread that needle with messaging? How do we be transparent? And at the same time, not leave this counter message or the counter perception that, well, we're simply reinforcing that it doesn't work. Because I will, come to Chaz's defense. We all know that there are substantive things about the recycling industry, including plastics, that we would not be here at this conference today if we didn't understand the value and all. Elizabeth, did you want to jump in?
Well, I think back, I think anyone who's visited any manufacturing facility, there's always yield loss. Like there's definitely yield loss in the process. And so like, it depends on what you're zooming in on from the media angle. Like, are you focusing on some of what is, what the problem is? We just don't know exactly what is not being recycled, exactly what is not making it. And if there's not an end market, if there's not demand and pull for it, like we're doing some very expensive sorting, to quote a friend of mine. So I think that finding the more transparency, it would be really great if we could know from a MRF level what's happening, from a state level what's happening, if assuming it's all reported. But it honestly, it's just hard to know. There are a lot of players, and in those gaps, that's why the partnership came to exist at all, because in those gaps between the stakeholders is where a lot of clarity and integrity can be shifted up and down the chain. So I think that coming together and making some agreements is a great place to start.
Yeah, but there's clearly a lot we need to do to fix aspects of recycling. And just to the point you were making about bringing more transparency to the system. Gary made a point in the chat about how California has its Truth in Recycling Labeling Act. One of the things we need to do is just make it less confusing, clearly. So we've got a lot of work there to do, but nonetheless, we're still here today. We still have to keep people engaged and how we move forward. Can I toss to you, I guess, a question to help us better understand? Behavior is complex. We know that there are many different ways that we get people to recycle. They have to have information as a precondition. They have to, they have to understand that there's value to it. But is there a dynamic, I guess, that you would describe here that is distinct than what you would normally be working with?
Yeah. So there's a lot of research on behavior change broadly across different pro-environmental behaviors, and then specifically on recycling. And I know we're going to dig into messaging, and that was sort of highlighted in the opening. But before we get to messaging, I just want to comment on the research findings about the effectiveness of messaging. And messaging can work. It's complicated. There's a lot of ins and outs. It works better in some situations than others, for some people than others. So messaging can work. But in general, the effects are small for messaging. Whereas if you can change the context of the behavior, you can simplify it, you can make it more convenient, you can reduce uncertainty, you get big changes in behavior. So I think too quickly we jump to messaging and education, and we say, well, the problem is that we need more information, we need more facts, we need more transparency. And I think the problem with that is that people get overloaded. And in looking strictly at behavior change, tell people what you want them to do, keep it simple, prioritize, and make it easy.
Mhm.
I love that, Wes. I think changing the context to me, and tell me more about what you're thinking. Some of changing the context to me is, so the number one reason in our research that that people were if they lost out, if they had a negative impact, it was from believing that the things weren't recycled. The second thing, which wasn't as big of as large of a group saying it, but it was the second thing, was that the others around me and the companies aren't doing it, believing that others around me and the companies aren't doing it. So changing that sort of social norm or context, or that being just the value that is happening. And those values are like, if messaging, if it was challenging to get messaging to work, it's really challenging to turn on values, especially across a nation. So if we just talk about like turning on values in a community, anyone, I think it relates to Dan's work, but anyone else, Wes, do you have any ideas of how that happens?
Well, I mean, when you talk about values, you're not going to change people's values per se. I mean, okay, we can embark on this, large scale societal changes in what's important, but I mean, you take people for where they are and message around those values. And fortunately for us, we see that people value recycling. Like I said, it's a moral issue, right? They see it as right and wrong. And I think that gives us a lot of opportunity, because we're already in their sort of favored space for that. So we don't have to convince them it's important to do. They already believe it's important to do. Now we have to activate that belief and turn it into behavior.
I disagree with that slightly. This is a country of 330 million people. We don't walk in lockstep on anything. And recycling is one of those things we simply don't walk in lockstep on. The SWANA study, based on the tests in a couple of Ohio communities, is very clear that a quarter of the population simply did not care about recycling. So I think there's a very fundamental question. Who are we aiming at? Are we aiming at the true believers, which I think would include everybody on this call and in the audience? Are we aiming at that large section that the SWANA study identified of people who want to recycle but need to know how to do it right? Are we trying to convince those who just don't care? And I would frankly, I'd rather go hunting where the ducks are. I think we need to work on those people who want to do it right, and then wait for the others.
The movable middle, in a
Yeah.
sense.
I love that. And I often do think about the adoption curve when it comes to this. My colleague, Scott Mao, he and I sit around and talk about adoption curves. So that one of the things, what I'm thinking about, Chaz, is in our confidence index, we asked people their satisfaction with different public services. So what's your satisfaction with public libraries? What's your satisfaction with trash? What's your satisfaction with recycling? To see how those things relate, because we don't get 100% agreement on things, and then we absolutely don't get 100% behavior on things by the recycling partnership. So I would encourage people to check out our Paying It Forward report if you need some weekend reading. But in order to get to 72% recovery rates, well, that's 80% of the people recycling 90% of what they could, capturing 90% of what they could. And so that's one way to look at it. So breaking it down, like a lot of times we're setting these goals of what needs to be done when we're not really sure how we're going to measure it. And I think that's going to continue to evolve as new EPR policies and measurements or goals come online. Is, well, what are we counting and how are we counting them?
Yeah, and I think you bring up a great point. I think there's way too much emphasis on policy and way too little emphasis on people. And the problem with policy is they're aspirational. They're passed by people who think that because they just passed a law, everybody in the country is going to follow along and do it. Because, hey, they're elected and they know everything. And that's not how it works in this country. And they tend to set goals that are not reality based, but are aspirational based. And I think we need to get back to these very fundamental issues of getting people to understand the need for recycling and getting them to get on the train and accept the fact that not everybody wants to do it.
Yeah, I would love to see like my dream is to see a communications infrastructure for recycling that is on par with the collection infrastructure, because we've given people, or not everyone certainly, but we've given a lot of people the ability to recycle by giving them access. And we've tried to make that as convenient as possible. There's still many behavioral barriers to participating when you have, like California is like 92, 94% access, but there's still behavioral gaps and they're not getting the capture. But so together we can build that communications infrastructure, is my hope.
Yeah.
But I'm thinking about the program that Dan's group is bringing forward, and I'd love to hear more from Dan about that initiative.
so-
It is very collaborative, and I think it's going to be great to see that roll out.
Yeah, so Dan, if you could tell us more about what you're doing. I know that there's, if we take this narrow issue that the Shelton survey was looking at, it's just, you know, the percentage of people who believe it all gets thrown out. I mean, that's a very demoralizing dynamic that sort of saps people of the energy. But we know there is messaging that can do sort of the opposite. Can you talk a little bit about what is happening in Washington?
Yeah, we hope so anyway. It's yet to roll out, so we'll see what happens. But yeah, we did quite a bit of research immediately after the National Source Stuff 2018. We did a survey of 750 Washington residents, and maybe compared to the national population, you know, we did find, you know, more overwhelming support for the, you know, the concept of recycling. Like we had the survey was getting more at specific contamination behaviors, because that was our initial approach, was like, let's just focus on reducing contamination. But we asked questions about, you know, what people like most about recycling, and, you know, overwhelmingly they think it's good for the environment, and it makes them feel like a good person for doing that. So our initial push was to change their ideas from thinking that, you know, recycling makes them a good person to recycling right makes them a good person. That was the sort of the first step. It was like an incremental approach. If anyone has worked in outreach, I think it's usually said it's hard to get more than one message across at once. You usually have to start with one thing. So we started with building on the recycle right messaging. And now we have another group that's been meeting for the last few years called it's King County Communications Consortium. And it's a partnership of Ecology, King County, and about a dozen cities in King County, along with 3 private haulers, WM, Recology, and Republic, who have all gotten together and have been meeting regularly, monthly, for the last few years to coordinate messaging. And it's been a great, you know, group effort, and getting people on the same page with messaging and collaborating. You know, it's something that I think is addressing what we saw in that survey, which was the biggest complaints from people, is how confusing recycling is, and how disjointed the messaging has been. So trying to address that first. And now the next step of the campaign is to restore confidence. And the planned campaign that hasn't started yet is to have messaging, you know, we'll see, you know, 30-second videos or whatever, showing materials being collected, showing them going to the MRF, showing them going to end users, and, you know, starting with plastics is we're going to start with, showing them being turned into pellets, and then showing them being turned into final products, other plastic bottles or carpet or coats or whatever it happens to be. So for us, it's just been, you know, like I said, an incremental approach to this campaign, trying to build on things and addressing one by one people's issues, starting with their, them wanting to recycle, wanting it to be good for the earth, and then their doubts about whether it's actually happening or not. So we're trying to address that head on with this new campaign.
Mhm. Fantastic. What you described with talking about what things get turned into, very much is reminiscent for those of you who remember the Keep America Beautiful campaign, PSA campaign from a few years ago. I want to be recycled, and that was based. Wes, I know I can't remember if you were directly involved with that, but we were asking what was it that got people just to feel more engaged on a certain level. Did you want to talk a little bit about that campaign?
Not so much on that campaign, but just building on what Dan was talking about and these bigger issues about the failures that are presented, but then who's responsible for that? And in messaging, to whom do we attribute the responsibility for that, let's say, failing grade? Right? Is it the responsibility of the individual consumers who are putting things in the wrong bin? Or is it the responsibility of some other entity, the haulers, governmental agencies, manufacturers? And that ascription of responsibility turns out to be really important. I have a graduate student who's doing research now to test what happens if you attribute it to yourself. Then you should feel some emotional response, probably a sense of guilt for failing to adequately follow through on these behaviors. But if you attribute it to some external entity, more likely you're going to feel something like outrage at that entity for failing to produce the desired outcome. So I think understanding these emotional responses that people have and how we frame it can be critically important. So I'll offer that up as well.
And I think that's an excellent point. And unfortunately, for reasons that it's hard to figure out who to blame, largely it's this COVID economy and some of the weird things it's done to individual companies. There will be a problem with paper being landfilled. It's been collected for recycling due to the functional. I mean, let's face it, everybody knows paper markets have been going down pretty dramatically in the last 6 weeks. And there are some serious issues now of inventory issues at both MRFs and at paper mills. I think we are going to be tested within a month or two by some hotshot reporter out to make their mark by exposing the fallacy of paper recycling. And we need to have a message. We need to be prepared for that. And the reality is, I'm not sure who you blame for that, because you're dealing with some worldwide economic issues.
Mm-hmm. There are the real issues and the media representation of it, but we also know that there's definitely misinformation that's being put out there. Elizabeth, is the recycling partnership or is anybody out there trying to coordinate and just do more direct messaging just to counter sort of like a rapid response when we see actual outright misinformation being put out there?
Yeah, that's a big question. It's like, how do you travel around the world and find a school of fish? Like we try to, we have an excellent Marcoms team who is very engaged with reporters and media. We try to get ahead and contact folks to try and get stories, positive stories, accurate stories out. We have a team who the team also reaches out when there is misinformation and offer to help them tell the story more accurately. We have great data, we have a great team, but it's not just, it can't just be us. Like, we've got to work on this together. It can't just be us. And so the data is what really helps tell the story. the examples of what's working, how it's working, getting more specific. And so what Dan was talking about, there is, from the beginning slides we looked at, there is still this aspirational strength behind recycling. But when it comes down to what about me, what about my community, what about the things I'm putting in my bin? And so I think a lot of programs can do a lot to reassure their residents by telling that story. Like I was visiting balconies, like I said this morning, and one person's rough estimate was that about 80% of the materials that are coming to that facility, and this was just off the cuff, like one was 80% of the materials coming to that facility are going within 100 to 200 miles of that location. And that's like, oh, okay, well, that is working. That is working. The other 20% is probably represents the more challenged markets, the areas where there isn't a demand for those for those bales or that material. And so it is, it is a multi-layered problem, and it's ongoing. And so it's kind of a hydra. So we have to work on it together. And the only way we can address it is with facts.
And just to add on to that, I mean, at the local or the state level, to Wes's earlier point, like we kind of have to skip over that assigning blame portion of the messaging, both because it takes us too long to develop messaging. It's just, when we started this new campaign, it was in response to, I think, a November 2021 SWANA report about recycling markets and how they were focusing on how the positive media attention hadn't followed the negative media attention from 2 years prior. So that was, our impetus for starting this campaign. And it's been a year and we're still developing this campaign. So we can't really speak to the specifics. And now it's a year later and the markets are upside down from where they were a year ago. So we skip over that and just focus on what Elizabeth was just talking about is, in Washington, we're focusing on the materials that are going to BC first. It's just right across the border. I think that makes it real for people to see that, it's not like these are being shipped, to China anymore. These are going 100 miles north, or they're going to our paper mills in the state for mixed paper and cardboard. And those are the materials we're focusing more on. And then for real reasons, and then just reasons of perception, we're not focusing as much on something like maybe polypropylene, because in Washington, there really aren't any local markets for polypropylene. Those are probably going east of the Mississippi for the most part. So we're gonna focus our messaging on what's most real and tangible, and hopefully that will be the, getting those core materials, restoring the confidence in those first, and then we'll hopefully build on other just general recycling markets more in the future, but starting there.
And Dan, you've got a great news hook in the state of Washington, because NORPAC just officially opened its new pulping machine at the Longview facility. It's when at full capacity, it's 400,000 tons a year of OCC and residential mixed paper. And NORPAC really needs two things. They need, first of all, the supply of raw materials, and then they need to have their end markets for the boxes and other materials they're going to be making. So it's a great story for the state of Washington.
Yeah, we 100%, and that's why we're focusing on that. But then on the other side of the issue is we've got a great glass recycler in Puget Sound, Strategic and RDOG having a partnership in Seattle, but that really only applies to the Puget Sound area. And then it's hard to, market anything or do outreach about, glass recycling, because we have a mountain range in the middle of the state and there's really no practical glass recycling happening right now east of the mountain. So it's a hard thing to balance for us in our messaging to, try to restore faith when you've got some materials that have great markets and then others that half the state has access to and half doesn't, and how to message around that.
When many years ago, I was at Humboldt State University managing the recycling program, and coming back to how we make recycling concrete and tangible. It's not this abstract things that get thrown, go away, but try and make it concrete in people's minds. we were trying to arrange with this one paper mill in Washington so that we would be taking the printing paper that they produce from their 100% post-consumer facility and have a truck show up. We would have a forklift take that off, and then we would load up with the bales that would take the truck back up there. And we had this whole vision of creating this whole public messaging around that. And the arrangement didn't come together, but it was all kind of trying to get back towards this. How do we take something this abstract and make it concrete so that people have a sense of it's real?
Yeah, sorry, Alec, I'll just add on that. I love that. And I saw earlier in the chat, Jay Bassett, hi Jay, was talking about some of the work he's doing in outreach or as part of an outreach. And I think that that's how it also is real, is trusted advisors that you can also check out our lit review. We have a multicultural lit review on participation on our website. And there are great, there are just great points in there. And trusted advisors, who are you hearing this from? What is it that reassures you? So what makes it real? But what also is it that reassures you? And if you think about who you trust in your life, you trust them because they're experts. You trust them because they do what they say they're going to do. You trust them because they are reliable and you've dealt with them in the past, or maybe they're just charismatic and they're great to be around. But and then you think of the people you don't trust. And so I think the things of collection needs to happen reliably. People need to have information. We found that only 1 in 4 people in our confidence index survey had responded that they had heard from a program, their recycling program, within a year. 1 in 4. So we can absolutely turn on all kinds of messaging. It costs money, but we can turn on all kinds of messaging to reach folks about exactly what Wes said, tell people what to do, keep it simple. And then what Dan's talking about of here's some reassurance. And then I also think the other kind of leg under that stool is outreach, to have trusted advisors making it real for people through their relationships. So it's really more in my mind, I'm wondering if it's a movement that has to happen.
Certainly, the point you made earlier that it would be nice to see a similar type of investment made into communication infrastructure and not focused exclusively on the physical infrastructure. I certainly, my perception that we've tended to think of communications from an industry perspective in somewhat one-dimensional terms. We just need to give people information, and clearly that by itself is not gone. It's where we need to be. I do want to throw out some, we have a couple of questions that have come in. One from Kieran. The Recycling Partnership has reported that there needs to be an investment of $6 billion over the next 4 to 5 years to level up recycling education. Do you think that we are on target to meet that identified need? EPA seems to be funding education separately from programming. Is that the best approach?
So I'll jump in. I mean, I expressed my position on this earlier. I think, yes, education can make a difference, but there was some really good content in the chat about, segmentations, percentage of the population that hold particularly strong or weak attitudes toward recycling. And I think those are all well taken, but through education, we're not going to change those minds. It's highly unlikely that we're going to convince somebody who's opposed to recycling that now they're going to start doing it. And I go back to the notion of focusing first on context and focusing first on the infrastructure. And there's a great saying that comes out of behavioral science, that you can behave people into thinking differently. And that if we work from that model, and we focus on making the behaviors easy and simple, and then on top of that, we start to change the minds and change the attitude. So I come back to that, and I appreciate the investment, and I hope that it gets acted on, because you can do a lot with that funding, but we can't count on education as solving this problem.
I love that concept. Could you say that again, Wes?
Yeah, it's behaving people into thinking differently, that we focus first on the action, and then the attitudes and beliefs will follow.
I love
So
that.
how do we focus on the actions for recycling?
I think we make it as simple as possible. So we prioritize particular materials. And I know Dan's going to object to this because in Washington, they have such a diverse collection infrastructure. But I think if we can simplify, we're going to get more people to engage in the behavior, and we're going to reach those, we'll call them lower level market segments, right? So the percentage of the population that maybe they're somewhat interested, but they're not particularly fervent about it.
Well, so I have a question though, because so in a sense, you're talking about segmenting and localizing messaging, but we also know, or at least there's been a lot of talk about inconsistency and how we all seem to be doing our own messaging and crossing wires. I mean, all the work and observation, the partnership is made around MERSHED communication. It is, I mean, where's that balance? Between localizing and creating different kinds of messaging that potentially create confusion if people are moving around from work to home to going on vacation.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Elizabeth.
Well, one of the things the partnership is doing is working on Recycle Check, which is working from all the way from the beginning. Are the materials recyclable? Are they actually, can they be recycled? Getting all the way through that pathway, and then connecting that to the communications where you can check locally whether or not it is recyclable through your zip code. And so I think the challenge in the miscommunications coming over each other is really, it's a challenge of coordination. And I would challenge anyone who is taking education dollars through EPA or is working on any policy that's passing. To Wes's point, what exactly is education? And I think what I see Jay keep pointing to is when you see the word education, I hope that we can think of it as outreach. Because if we're trying to get to behavior change, education is one part of it. Yes, people have to know what to recycle, but they have to have the access. That's the first stage gate. They have to know what and when to recycle. That's the second stage gate. But the very important third stage gate to unlocking the recycling that isn't already happening is around engagement, making it relevant for people. And I think through some coordination, through some best practices, we can help local organizations do some of the lift there, where they don't have to start from scratch and coming up with what is and what isn't, and how to get those messages out.
Yeah, and to Wes's point, the only thing I object to is that within our current system, doing that sort of harmonized messaging is impossible because everything is so segmented, but that is not what we would like to see. And we've done with the King County Communications Consortium, that's a voluntary effort. We've also published, a statewide contamination reduction and outreach plan, which is another voluntary effort to try to increase harmonization and coordination with local programs. But we also do support actual, policy changes as the Department of Ecology, whether that be, a uniform statewide list or, some sort of EPR policy if it comes to that, or labeling standards that harmonize things. It's not possible, I don't think, to do that voluntarily. So bigger picture, longer term, as great as these efforts have been, the voluntary efforts to try to collaborate, I think, as more of a take home point, I think we need more, probably to more Wes's point is, there will need to be, it can't just be outreach and education. It needs to be actual policy changes to foster that.
Yeah, we're getting to the end of our time. Any final closing thoughts anybody wants to offer beyond what we've touched on already?
Just one quick one, Alec, and I'm looking in the chat and I see Maggie Clark posted a comment about it has to be accepted by your community and your peers. And, I think one great way to counteract these negative messages and negative stories is to highlight our successes. And Dan's talking about highlighting successes by showing that materials are being created out of recycled content, but I think we can do it in other ways as well. I mean, the large amount of material that's collected each day, each week, each month, the high percentage of people who support recycling programs, the large number of people who do it on a daily basis, like these are successes that we can highlight that serve to cultivate this norm that recycling is part of our community. And so I appreciate that comment from Maggie, and I just wanted to highlight that. And I think we didn't really get to it as a strategy, but I think it can be really effective.
Yeah, good. Any other last comments, points that anybody wants to drop in? Okay. Well, I want to thank all of you for participating in the panel. This has been a good conversation. I don't think any of us feels like we've quite finished this topic. This is one that I'd like to see a lot more focus on with presentations, but we do what we can for today. So to just pivot and to take us out with the end of the conference, let me pull up some slides here. Again, I want to thank everybody for joining us over the last couple of days. We've had a lot of great discussions around a lot of topics around recycling, but also, we've been looking at reuse and other upstream solutions. And just want to point out that that we partner with Zero Waste USA, who is going to be doing another conference at the very end of this month, November 30th and December 1st, the National Zero Waste Conference. They're going to have many of the same types of sessions, but focusing obviously more on the upstream solutions. So I encourage folks to check out the program and consider attending that conference at the end of the month. We will be early next week. Look for an email to drop into your inbox with a survey for us. This has been very helpful for us to get that feedback. What do you like about this conference? What don't you like? What could we improve going forward? Is this still a model of doing virtual conferences? I know in a lot of cases we've gone back to in person, but we'd love to get that feedback, how we can, as a National Recycling Coalition, move forward and provide this conference and other content to be of use to what you're trying to do on the local level. Want to point out also that we will be posting information, all the presentation slides. We'll have recordings from today. We'll also have an attendee directory that will all be posted online, and we'll be sending out communications around these as well. This is going to take a little bit longer. We've got a lot of presentations and others to prepare and get set up. So it may be closer to the end of the month, but we will be sending out an email once everything is available online to check out. So please do look for that when it comes. And I'll point out, Julia's dropped into the chat there. We've got a link to the survey. So if you're already have thoughts and you want to just jump in, feel free to click that link when we sign off. Otherwise, look for an email next week. I want to thank everybody who helped to make the conference possible. In addition to myself, I was joined by Gary Liss and Leslie Lukash from the NRC board as the conference co-chairs in planning. We've had a great team working together over the last 3 years. This was also our second year working with Julie Rhodes, who it's been mostly the quiet behind the scenes person, but she deserves a lot of the credit for making this a smooth conference, as well as her team, Emily Jackson, Angelica Lopez, and Chris Barnick. So thank you to everybody who helped make this possible. We really appreciate the effort that you've made. And finally, I want to make just a last shout out and thank you to our sponsors who make the conference possible. Again, to ISRI and to Retract Connect, our gold sponsors. And on our silver sponsor level, Paint Care, Bush Systems, Balcones Resources, SCS Engineers, Strategic Materials, Mid-America Regional Council, Solid Waste Management District, and also our bronze sponsors, Zero Waste Associates, the Carbon Council, Payzone Systems, Bob Geddert, and Race to Zero Waste. So thank you for making this conference possible. And also finally to our media partners, Resource Recycling, who we've had the pleasure of working with for several years and been longtime friends of the NRC, helping us, as well as Waste Advantage magazine. So that's it. Thank you again for attending. We hope that you've found value from this. Fill out the survey when you get the link, and we look forward to seeing you down the road. Thank you.